Hi everyone, my name is James Feeney. Welcome to or back to my channel. Today I thought we would combine two of my favorite things in life, some literature and some tarot, specifically some poetry and a Marseille deck. You may know that I do love to combine my love of tarot with books quite often and find ways to work the two together. I have a video on book mapping with the tarot, which is well suited to prose and novels, I would say. I also have a video called, I think, Cartomancy and Critical Thinking, which is based around an exercise I use to think more critically and dissect books after I've read them, so I'll link those around or below in case you are curious. But in my recent video where I was speaking more so to memory magic and going through some of my memories, I was rereading some of the poetry that I had read in a course that I was enrolled in when I was in school, and I realized how much I'd neglected that facet or area of literature. So you may know also that I am in the midst of studying the Marseille quite heavily, so I was online, I came across this book, The Flowers of Evil by Charles Baudelaire. This is a lovely edition from, I believe it's the Blackwell Press, if I'm not mistaken. I know they are known, Black Letter Press, apologies. I got this off of Treadwell's, I think. I think that there may be a free PDF of this sort of volume of poetry online, and I know there are less expensive editions, but something about this cover called to me, so I went for this specific copy, and I thought it would be well suited alongside studying French tarot, so having some French poetry. This is an English translation, it's not originally in English, and there were I was a bit wary in, I would say, wanting to read a translated text, especially when it's poetry. I think translating anything in terms of books and literature is difficult enough, but poetry, where words are so consciously chosen and the way that everything is arranged and written has so much meaning, it almost makes me feel like so much is lost in translated poetry. But I thought I would go for it based on the description, and so far I'm absolutely loving it. You can see little tabs that I've put on it for certain poems that I want to revisit or potentially use in this video. So really what I want to get to is dissecting a few of these poems and looking at them in terms of tarot. Now, this author, Charles Baudelaire, and this specific volume here, there are many poems that seem to speak, in my opinion, at least as a reader, very specifically to tarot, or at least some of the themes and elements present will reference the moon, or a sort of magician-like character who has dice and a knife on a table. Things to me that are just so close to very specific imagery from the tarot that it's hard for me to not make that connection, and that's happened with many of the poems in this. There was also a poem that overtly spoke to playing cards and the court cards in that, which was really fun. So I thought that we might actually do maybe a little bit of bibliomancy, or perhaps divine from a poem, and then get the message or ascertain some sort of message with the tarot. So as you know, poetry doesn't always necessarily create a cohesive story. I thought we might go through a few poems that I found to have a lot of very vivid language that seems to speak very closely to the tarot, find tarot cards that might be applicable and create a storyline out of it to maybe dissect the poetry. I think this is a great way to better understand what you're reading if you do enjoy poetry and more, I would say, abstract styles of writing in general. This might be a great exercise if you have a book of poetry on hand. I've really been enjoying this. I did a little bit of research on this specific book, and I know it was originally published in 1857. It was written in 1840, I believe. It was quickly sort of taken off the market because of the less savory aspects during the time and the concern as to how it would affect societal morals. And then it was republished, taking out quite a bit of what was deemed to be the, I would say, more polarizing elements of the poetry. and then it was taken off the market completely, I know, for a while, and then came back in the mid-20th century, I want to say. So I think upon reading this, of course, it is quite a saucy book of poetry. I would say by today's standards, it wouldn't be so controversial, although there are elements that are very much of the time period, and I know some things that are mentioned in this wouldn't necessarily be deemed appropriate for today's culture and language, so it's very interesting to reflect in that way, whereas other bits that I'm sure weren't very appropriate for the society at large at the time are probably quite fine to speak about now, things like sex and the human body and descriptive things of that nature. There definitely seems, or at least Charles Baudelaire seems to have a bit of a penchant for talking about sex and his love of women, and also, I would say, death and more macabre elements in combination with the two, so it's very interesting to say the least. And so I thought we would get over to my tarot table. I would select a few of the poems that I find to be very well suited to using the tarot to, I would say, divine the message from the poem. So I guess this would be sort of a two-factor method of divination, divining the story through tarot, and then divining a greater message once we've outlined the sort of more narrative structure through the tarot. So if that at all sounds interesting to you, stay tuned. I know, in my opinion, I think these poems are really interesting in that there is quite a bit of depth here, and I would like to actually understand and sort of mull over these poems in greater detail through the tarot. So we're going to head over to my tarot table and get right into that. All right, everyone, so we're over at my tarot table. I've got the poetry, I've got the cards. Now, my idea here was to separate out the majors, the courts, and the aces specifically, because I think that in a Marseille deck, they're better for telling the story in terms of visual elements. I didn't see as many passages and lines and stanzas that made me think of the minors in this way, so I separated them out. We might bring them in, we shall see. But I think we'll start with these. Now, the reason I'm using the Marseille deck is not just because I'm studying it lately and because this is French poetry, but also because of the time period and where this was written. So, assuming that Charles Baudelaire knew about tarot at all or was interested in it or anything like that, a Marseille deck of some style would have probably been what he was exposed to and knew or might even be referencing. We weren't in a time period where Rider-Waite-Smith or Thoth or any of those systems were circulating or published or even a sparkle in somebody's eye. So without further ado, I guess we'll pick, I was thinking maybe picking about maybe 3 or so poems and just seeing how this might work. The first one I have up here that I'd marked or flagged was The Possessed. So I shall read that, and then we will kind of pick it apart through the cards, laying them out in a way to iterate the story in some way. So we have The Possessed. The sun in crape has muffled up his fire. Moon of my life, half shade yourself like him. Slumber or smoke, be silent and dim, and in the gulf of boredom plunge entire. I love you thus, however, if you like, live some bright star from its eclipse emerging to flaunt with folly where the crowds are surging. Flash, lovely dagger, from your sheath and strike. Light up your eyes from chandeliers of glass. Light up the lustful looks of louts that pass. Morbid or petulant, I thrill before you. Be what you will, black night or crimson dawn, no fiber of my body tautly drawn, but cries, beloved demon, I adore you. Now, I'm not the best at reading poetry. I know there is very much an art and style to the way it can be read. I'm not well versed in that, but I figure let's start picking this apart. So some of the words that stand out to me immediately, of course, we've got sun, and I thought that was very interesting in conjunction with fire. We've got the moon mentioned here as well, so those two in connection to one another. We've got the idea of silence, which reminds me of a few things. I love you thus, so the idea of this having to do with love and the possession. The first feelings that I get is that, of course, this is about a metaphor for being in love and how it can overtake somebody, and using various sort of like metaphors and analogies to equate love to fantastical and beautiful functions that we might see in the world around us. But I think it would be interesting to maybe dissect how the love is described here through characters and the characters of the tarot. So We also have like some bright star from its eclipse emerging. So we have clearly the sun, the moon, and the star present in this. We've also got flash lovely dagger from your sheath and strike, which makes me potentially think of a court card. Then we've got, let's see, what else we hear? Lustful looks of louts that passed. That brings to mind a little bit of other things. We've got morbid or petulant, I thrill before you. And then down here we've got beloved demon, I adore you. So I'm thinking of more so the idea of shackling oneself to something in the way that we might imagine the devil card to be exemplified. So I'm going to pull out the moon. The idea of choice in the love is here, although the lover's card doesn't necessarily speak to that romantic love. We've also got, let's see, I think death might play a role here. The sun for sure. We've got the devil. The fool. No, wait, maybe not the fool. Not the fool in this one, in my opinion anyway. Definitely the star. I think judgment might have a role to play in this narrative. I like the idea of the hermit when speaking about silence. Let's see what else. I do like the idea of strength in terms of lust. Maybe that's the inner Thoth nerd in me. When I see the word lust, I automatically go for the strength card. And so then I'm thinking of who this person is who is being described and maybe putting a face to them through the court. And also we spoke to the idea of this dagger and that being unsheathed in some way. So I'm immediately picking the Page of Swords to speak to perhaps the person writing this, the author, in him maybe depicting himself as the person with the dagger. And then we've got the beauty that he is after, this woman he's pining for. And for this card, the way that this person is described, I'm almost imagining them as more of an idea than a literal person, so I almost don't want to pick a card for them, at least not yet. Now, these are the first ones that came to mind. Based on the poem, I'm allotting this card to be playing the role of the author, who, as we saw in this poem, to flaunt with folly where the crowds are surging, flash a lovely dagger from your sheath and strike. It seems like he's speaking to someone, but I also might think that he is speaking of himself, or that the love is unsheathed and striking at him. Either way, something about the idea of the Page of Swords for him is fitting to me. And a page, of course, I think that the idea of this exciting love is very youthful. So I've picked out the Page of Swords. Now, the idea of this lust that almost feels in some ways violent. It's so powerful. It reminds me of the Force card or Strength. So I'm seeing this as the main action card in a potential story coming here. I think that the Hermit is a more reflective element because I would say the idea of this silence, so it appears that a lot of this is going on inside of the narrator as opposed to him voicing these things and taking action in the real world. So I almost imagine the Hermit as a silencing force that's sort of cloaking the idea of strength. Now, there was the mention of, where is it? Light up my eyes from chandeliers of glass, light up the lustful looks of louts that pass. Where is that part? However you like, be silent dim. I think I like the idea of the crimson dawn, of the rising sun being depicted by the Judgment card, a calling to a beginning in this. Now, the beginning, we saw this sort of relationship between the moon, the sun, and the star, and the idea of the star being eclipsed and the sun coming out in some way. Let's see. Some bright star from its eclipse emerging to flaunt with folly where crowds are surging. And then at the beginning, we start with the sun and crepe has muffled up his fire. So I'm imagining that the sun is kind of at the background, the moon muffling the sun, so the clarity sort of being, I would say, obscured by uncertainty and mystery, which might describe the actual woman being spoken about. And then we have the idea of a star that is eclipsed. Now, that makes me think that the star who I think if anything, perhaps the star speaks the most to the love who is at the center of this poem, would be somewhere between the sun and the moon, in a very literal sense, or in a less literal sense, I guess, because of course, if we think about it, the sun is a star and stars are far off and the moon's quite close. But if we're thinking about this in terms of the poem, I'm arranging them in this fashion where we have the moon at the forefront, the star sort of situated in between, and the sun in the background. And then I would say perhaps that we've got the Judgment card calling forth what's arising here. And we have over here the dichotomy between the Strength and the Hermit sort of vying for dominance, where the author is concerned as a narrator. And then I do think that we do have mention of something that makes me think that the devil would be present. Where is that? But cries, beloved demon, I adore you. Now, that makes me think of the lovers in conjunction to the devil. I think that, for example, we might imagine that this person here, instead of making a choice, decides to be a little bit greedy and perhaps try to pick both of these women or have the best of everything in life in terms of this relationship, isn't willing to compromise, really wants all of the beauty, and in doing so, almost warps what it is that they have into something that's a little bit, I would say, less savory for them. So I would say that this depicts the outcome, whereas here we've got the beauty that is being beheld by the author, seeing this, the combination of the obscuring moon eclipsing the star and also muffling out the sun, so a lack of clarity, an air of mystery, and the beauty being somewhere trapped in between. We've got the idea of that crimson dawn that we saw at the end, the calling forth of perhaps the love. We have this sort of battle or war that's waged within the narrator, and then our outcome where we saw beloved demon, I love you, or something like that, where the idea of trying to choose everything or have it all ends up creating something that is more of a possession than it is a love. The idea of loving someone being a little bit more freeing, and when trying to possess somebody, it turns out most of the time that ruins the love. So I do see this being our final outcome here as a story being told about love. And I think now, having done that, I understand this poem in a very different light, a lot more fully. And I think that this, for me, is a valuable way of dissecting a poem where I may have previously read this and not really fully understood what it was that I was looking at. And now I can look at it like an illustrated story in some ways and really understand it. Now, the next one that I wanted to touch upon was The Living Torch. So I'll read this one for us. The living torch. Those lit eyes go before me in full view. Some cunning angel magnetized their light. Heavenly twins, yet my own brothers too, shaking their diamond blaze into my sight. My steps from every trap or sin to save. In the straight road of beauty they conduct me. They are my servants, and I am their slave, obedient in whatever they instruct me. Delightful eyes, you burn with mystic rays, like candles in broad day. Red suns may blaze, suns may blaze, but cannot quench their still fantastic light. Those candles burn for death, but you for waking. You sing the dawn that in my soul is breaking, stars which no sun could ever put to flight. So here is more of a descriptive manner of the human being, of the person who's on the other end, the receiver of the love that the author or narrator gives. So this makes me think that things have progressed in some way. So this wasn't the end of the story, very much so the first chapter. So I'm seeing a reprise of the sun, but actually at the forefront now, not so obscured by the moon, which we saw earlier. And I also think, for example, that the idea of the hermit has sort of been dispelled by force, so he can head on out for now. I still like the idea of the narrator as the Page of Swords here. I think we do get a more concrete way of looking at the recipient of the love in this case. So instead of it being just an abstract concept, now it seems to be a woman on the end of this affection would be the Queen of Wands, I think describing her as a human torch, or using this poem to illustrate that idea would very much fit with the Queen of Wands or Queen of Batons. So they've got them here. We have the element of force. I think this is very much his passion, very much the author's passion in the way of being spoken to here. We still have the idea of the devil. They are my servants and I am their slave, obedient in whatever they instruct me. But now I'm seeing that it is more so the author or narrator who is at the whim of the two sort of imps, as opposed to, I would say, controlling them. So these are more so the desires or the impulses and the love that drives the narrator. And instead of him chaining them to himself, he very much is chained to them and they can drag him in whatever direction they please. Now, what else do we have? Delightful eyes, you burn with mystic rays like candles in broad day. Red suns may blaze, but cannot quench their still fantastic light. Now, I'm viewing this more so as in many ways, I'm tempted to view it as the Ace of Wands, almost like this mega torch or candle of sorts, a guiding light to connect, I would say, the two. It feels like the idea of light and fire is where they mix, is where they're able to sort of meet and touch hands in some way. And I think we can eliminate the idea of the lovers. The choice has very much been made, and we're now facing, I would say, the repercussions or a sort of backwards seeming depiction of the devil, where the narrator is being drawn in quite a few directions. Now, we've also got, let me just make sure I'm reading this right. Some cunning angel magnetized their light, heavenly twins, yet my own brothers too. So the idea of the light and the sun working in the favor of the narrator. So this sun is very much pushing the love toward him. But we also see reference to that angel, and the first angel that I think of here would be Temperance. And I think that this is more so meant to function as that Cupid-esque figure that we saw in the Lovers card. So this would be sort of like divine timing, divine force bringing the two together, or seeing it as more of a fated act. And you see, of course, the two chalices and the Temperance being poured between each other. They're interchangeable, their contents, their emotions become one. And so we're starting to see the amalgamation of the sort of essence of the narrator with his beloved. And so in one way, they are two separate vessels who share the same contents. And that's how I'm viewing this Human Torch poem. Now, the final one I thought we might look at is The Voice. Thought this one was really interesting. I'll just move that. My cot was next the library, a babel where fiction jostled science, myth and fable, Greek dust with Roman ash, and there met the sight, and I was but a folio in height. When two voices addressed me, earth's cake, said one, and full of sweetness, I can make your appetite to its proportions equal, forever and forever, without sequel. Another said, come, rove in dreams with me, past knowledge, thought, or possibility. The voice sang like the wind along the shore, and though caressing, frightened me the more. I answered, O sweet voice, and from that date could never name my sorrow or my fate. Behind the giant scenery of this life, I see strange worlds, with my own self at strife. Ecstatic victim of my second sight, I trail huge snakes at my ankles bite. And like an ancient prophet from that time, I've loved the desert, found the sea sublime. I've wept at festivals and laughed at wakes, and found in sourest wines a sweet that slakes. Falsehoods for facts I love to swallow whole, and often shall stargazing in a hole. But the voice cheers, keep dreaming, it's a rule, no sage can dream such beauty as a fool. I found that one to be really beautiful and moving, actually, when reading it. So for me, I'm going to round these up because this is not, in my opinion, very connected to our former stories. Those past two did seem to be speaking of similar elements, but in this one, I'm actually going to work backwards. So our last line actually speaks to the Fool, but it seems like we're being alluded, or I just pulled out the Magician. It seems like we're being alluded to the idea of the Fool throughout that poem. So now I am categorizing or assigning the Fool to the narrator or the author here, but the Fool is actually at the end as opposed to the beginning, which is very much a Marseille way to put the Fool, if you ask me. So I think here a card that definitely enters the fray is the High Priestess being spoken about in this idea of the voice. I think the voice is sort of emanating from the High Priestess. Now, we've also got, for example, a lot of these natural elements of the world. We have the idea of cake and sweetness and the actual physical pleasures of life. And for me, that is very much the Ace of Pentacles or the Ace of Coins, symbolizing all of that in its riches and wonder. So in some ways, I imagine this to be a little bit of a circuitous poem where the Fool is heading back or heading forward, but by heading forward, he's following a voice from the past that's sort of like, I'm imagining her voice calling out this way and the Fool going this way, and there sort of being this sort of connection outside of time and space. Now, it seems like the idea of the tangible reality that drives the force is something that we would see in the middle. Now, my cot was next, the library Babel. So, of course, there's the part of me that is a Thoth nerd that's definitely going to pull out the Strength card here and attach the idea of lust and driving force and willpower and that sort of inner fire, and is going to attach that. So it's almost like feeding the lion the sort of gifts of the land or the earth in some way, really trying to capitalize on those or ingest them. Greek dust with Roman ash, where met the sight, and I was but a folio in height. When two voices addressed me, earth's cake said one, and full of sweetness I can make. Now, that makes me think that there's more of this call to action or call and answer happening. So there's two voices. It makes it very clear. And while the High Priestess might be issuing both sort of decrees to the Fool, I do get the feeling that the counterpart here would be the Empress, if we can find her. Oh, there we are. Kept overlooking her. Perhaps it's a dialogue happening between the Empress and the High Priestess, where they're talking to each other and maybe the Fool's just overhearing, or they both have a message for the Fool and are trying to sort of get together on their message or have conflicting messages. They seem to be looking at each other like they may be conspiring to send him something. And so for now, they're on the same page. I answered, "Oh, sweet voice, from that date, could never name my sorrow or my fate. Behind the giant scenery of this life, I see strange worlds with my own self at strife, ecstatic victim of my second sight." So that's very much, I think, the Fool encountering both the High Priestess and the Empress, with the idea of satisfying his desires, which is very much priestess energy, with the second sight, which to me feels a lot like the Popess or the High Priestess. I wept at festivals and laughed at wakes, and found in sourest wines a sweet that slakes. So this idea of self-discovery, of opening one's eyes, the idea of festivals and laughing, and all of that to me is very much of the Fool's nature. But the voice cheers, keep dreaming. It's a rule, no sage can dream such beauty as a fool. And there I'm almost tempted to reincorporate the hermit. And I think the way that, for example, the High Priestess creates some sort of contrast between the sage, the idea of the sage, which I attribute to the hermit, and the Fool, almost in that there's a beauty in the lightheartedness, in the emptiness that the Fool encompasses, versus the sage, who is quite full. And the idea of this lantern here that is very much illuminated, it's heavy, it's full of light, it's already kind of been occupied by something, whereas we could imagine the Fool's sort of bag or knapsack to be completely empty at the beginning, and toward the later stages it's fully enveloped or filled with his very own light. And so there is a beauty in the emptiness, that there's something still yet to be filled, versus the sage, which has seen their journey, who has filled up with experience and now is sort of in some ways maybe jaded or less excitable at the idea of newness. So something about this is both exciting and saddening. It's like a bittersweet poem in my opinion, but a little bit more sweet than bitter if you ask me. Now, I think that takes us through the few poems that I thought I might share. I hope that this was something that you found interesting potentially and can use for
exercises of your own at home, if you have poetry that you're interested in, if you care to use the cards to deconstruct stories, whether it's through poetry or novels or anything like that, I would be very, very curious. And if you found this to be something that was a fun exercise to just watch and participate while you hung out with me. I hope you are all well. Like and subscribe if this was fun or interesting. And until next time, bye.